I used to work the overnight shift at a small roadside motel just off the interstate. There were only about 20 rooms, and since it was a small town, most nights more than half of them sat empty. My hours were 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 nights a week. During those hours, I was usually the only person at the front desk. Most nights, it was just me and the occasional trucker stopping in for a shower or a place to sleep for a few hours. And honestly, those shifts were usually boring in the best possible way, quiet and pretty uneventful. But every now and then the phone would ring. The calls always came after midnight, and the number was always blocked. After a while, I realized it was the same guy who called in every time. The first time he called, he just asked if we had any rooms available. Completely normal question. I told him the nightly rate and waited. He didn't say anything. For a few seconds, all I could hear was him breathing into the phone. Then he hung up. I assumed he didn't like the price. People hang up all the time, especially late at night. So I didn't think much about it. But a few nights later, he called again. Same time, same blocked number, and the same voice I recognized right away. He had this slow southern drawl that stuck with you. He asked the same question, waited for my answer, and then hung up again. After that, it started happening pretty regularly. The calls usually came somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. Sometimes he asked how many rooms we had left. One time he asked if the doors locked from the inside. The questions themselves weren't that strange. Technically, they were things someone might ask if they were thinking about staying at a motel. It's just that he kept calling, and it's the way he asked them too. There was no emotion in his voice at all, just flat. I kept telling myself it was probably just a bored trucker, or someone with insomnia who wanted to hear another person's voice. Still, I started paying more attention to the parking lot at night. By the third week, I was almost expecting the phone to ring, and most nights it did. I mentioned it once to the girl who worked the morning shift. She laughed and said it sounded like I had a secret admirer. I didn't see it that way. I'm not in high school anymore, and I definitely don't want mystery attention from someone who refuses to show their face. One night when the phone rang, I decided to ask him something back. I asked what his name was. There was a long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he spoke again. Instead of answering, he just said he'd be there soon, and then hung up. He never showed up that night, but the way he said it stuck with me. A few days later, he called again, earlier than usual. I remember because I had just opened my first energy drink, and it wasn't even 2:30. This time he said he'd be there around 3. Then he hung up. That part was new. He had never mentioned an actual time before. I thought about calling my manager, but I didn't even know what I'd say. The guy hadn't threatened me. All he'd done was say he was coming, so I waited. By about 2:50, I was sitting behind the desk with my phone in my hand, just in case I needed to call 911. The parking lot was empty. 3 o'clock came and went. Nobody showed up. Then around 3:30, headlights swept across the lobby windows, and an old pickup truck rolled into the lot. It was rusted and loud, the kind of engine that echoes when it idles. The truck pulled forward and stopped directly in front of the glass doors, perfectly lined up with the desk where I was sitting. The engine shut off. The lights went dark, but no one got out. I sat there watching it. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. All I could see in the glass was my own reflection under the lobby lights. At one point, the motel phone lit up like it was about to ring, but it never did. The screen just glowed for a second and went dark again. Eventually, the truck started back up. The brake lights flared red, it backed out slowly, turned toward the highway, and disappeared. That was it. No threat, no crime, nothing I could actually report. but it's one of the strangest moments I've ever experienced. I told my manager about it the next day and she barely reacted. She just said night shifts attract weird people and that some folks call motels late at night just to hear another voice. Maybe that's true, but I remember thinking I definitely wasn't getting paid enough to deal with whatever that was. That was pretty much the end of it for me. I quit the job the same week and eventually found a day shift at a hotel. There are more people around now, more noise, a lot less time alone with my thoughts at 3 in the morning. Every once in a while I'll be driving home late and an old pickup will pull behind me at a red light. Tinted windows, headlights just a little too bright. And that same tight feeling settles in my stomach before I can talk myself out of it. I tell myself it's probably not him. It almost definitely isn't. But I still check my mirrors anyway. Every single time. I never figured out why he kept calling. Or why he stopped. I only know that the last time he said he was coming, I'm pretty sure that was him sitting in that truck right in front of me. Hi, my name is Heather. I work in HR at a mid-sized corporate office in Michigan. Without boring you with the details, most of my days are spent handling onboarding, compliance paperwork, internal reports, and stepping in when small workplace issues start turning into bigger ones. Because of that, I'm not the type to call someone creepy just because they make me feel uncomfortable. I want to preface with that because it matters given the job I have. I work in HR. My whole role revolves around separating intent from awkwardness, understanding that most people don't actually mean harm, that discomfort doesn't always equal danger. Sometimes a strange interaction is just social incompetence mixed with bad timing. I've seen plenty of that. Most guys in offices fall into that category. A little stiff, a little overly friendly, sometimes saying things that land wrong, even if they didn't mean them that way. You learn how to deal with it. You smile politely, keep the conversation moving, avoid sharing too much, and get on with your day without letting it stick to you. So when I first started noticing a coworker named Mark, who doesn't work here anymore, I kept telling myself he was probably fine. Mark worked upstairs somewhere in accounting or compliance. I never actually knew which department. He was older than most of us, maybe mid to late 40s. He wasn't flirtatious. He never complimented me. He didn't try to start conversations or ask personal questions. The truth is, he barely spoke at all. And that's part of why it took me so long to trust the feeling that something about him was off. There was never a moment where I could point and say this is when it crossed the line. He never really crossed one. He was just around, lingering in places where he didn't seem to have a reason to be. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Offices are repetitive environments. You walk the same routes, use the same printers, take breaks at similar times. You start seeing the same people in the same places. Patterns form whether you want them to or not. So when I started running into Mark more often, I told myself it was just that, routine. I'd walk into the break room and he'd already be there, not making coffee, not using the microwave. He was just standing there. I'd go to the printer and notice someone behind me. I'd turn around and it would be Mark, staring at the machine like it required his full concentration. Sometimes when I left for lunch, I'd see him leaning against the wall near the exit. He'd have his phone in his hand, but the screen was dark. He wasn't actually doing anything. I kept telling myself I was probably reading too much into it. But what I couldn't ignore was that Mark never looked surprised to see me. Most people do. There's always that quick flicker of recognition, that subtle, "Oh hey, you again," expression people have when they run into someone repeatedly. Mark never had that reaction. When I noticed him, it always felt like he had already been watching me before I realized he was there. The first time things actually bothered me was one evening when I stayed late at the office. We had reports due the next day, so I was finishing some work after most people had already gone home. I remember the building was quiet in that strange after-hours way where every small sound feels louder than it should. At one point, I heard footsteps. I looked up and saw Mark standing 2 cubicles away, facing me. There was no reason for him to be on my floor at that time, at all. He gave a small smile and said he didn't realize anyone else was still there. I gave a polite response, something neutral, and he nodded before walking away. If you wrote the interaction down, it wouldn't sound like anything. But I remember sitting there afterward with my hands hovering above the keyboard, trying to convince myself I was probably overreacting. Probably. About a week later, I was leaving around sunset. Once again, I was the last one out. As I walked up to my car with my keys in my hand, I noticed something in the reflection on the driver's side window. Through the glass, I could see the reflection of the building behind me. On the second floor, in a window where the blinds were barely open, I saw movement. I turned around, and there was Mark again. He was standing behind the blinds, looking straight down at me. I recognized him immediately from his hair and the same shirt he always seemed to wear. The moment he realized I had seen him, he stepped back out of view quickly, like he knew he'd been caught. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the car door handle, trying to figure out how long he had been watching. Probably longer than I wanted to think about. The next morning, I mentioned it to my manager. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't use the word creepy. I just explained that Mark had been around me a lot lately, and it was starting to make me uneasy. She listened, but the conversation didn't really go anywhere. Her summary was that Mark was quiet but harmless, probably just socially awkward. That word stuck with me. Harmless. One positive thing did come from that conversation. After that, Mark stopped appearing on my floor. No more break room encounters, no hallway sightings, no lingering presence. I assumed someone had spoken to him privately and he'd adjusted his behavior. I even let myself relax. Then, one morning I came in early to prepare for a Zoom presentation, earlier than usual. The office lights were still dim and the building was mostly empty. I sat down at my desk and noticed something immediately. My computer screen was already on. Not the login screen, my actual desktop. I froze for a moment. I always shut down my computer before leaving work, especially in HR. It's drilled into you during training. You don't leave anything open. My first thought was that IT must have pushed some kind of overnight update. But when I touched the mouse, the browser window was still open. Out of curiosity, I checked the history. Facebook, my Facebook profile, my photos. Someone had been scrolling through my account. Then my husband's profile. I stared at the screen trying to slow my breathing. I hadn't logged into Facebook on my work computer in months. I always use my phone. And I definitely hadn't looked up my husband's profile. He lives with me. No one else should have had access to my workstation but me. No one. I locked the screen and just sat there for a while. Later that day, I reported it through the proper internal channels. A few hours later, IT confirmed there had been after-hours activity on my computer. They wouldn't tell me anything else. I asked if they could check the security cameras. They said they would review them. No one followed up. A few days later, Mark stopped coming into work entirely. There was no announcement, no explanation. The only thing anyone told me was that there had been behavioral concerns. That was it. I never found out what the cameras showed, or if they showed anything at all. All I know is that he was gone. Terminated. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. But the feeling of being watched and never completely went away. That was over a year ago. I still work at the same company, but I'm more careful now. I pay more attention to the parking lot. I trust my instincts faster, and yes, I eventually got my concealed carry license. Maybe that sounds extreme, but once someone watches you like that, you don't really stop looking over your shoulder. You just get better at noticing when someone else is looking first. This isn't my story, and I want to be upfront about that. Nothing like this has ever happened to me personally. I heard it while I was living in Thailand, and it's one of those things that stuck with me long after I moved back to California. At the time, I was there on a work visa, teaching English at a private school. Most Sundays, I played pickup soccer with a mix of locals and foreigners at a small field outside the city. People came and went, but there were always a few regular faces. One of them was a guy named Bon. We didn't know each other very well at first. We weren't co-workers or close friends. We just ended up talking here and there after games, mostly because his English was excellent. After a while, those little conversations stopped feeling forced and started feeling natural. One night after a game, we were sitting on the sidelines cooling off when he told me something I've never really been able to explain. He didn't tell it like a ghost story. There was no suspense, no dramatic build-up. He just started talking, and I listened. For context, Bon was a paramedic. He was well educated and came across as extremely practical. He wasn't someone who leaned into superstition, and he didn't talk about spirits or curses the way some locals do. If anything, he sounded slightly skeptical even while telling me what happened. That's part of why it stayed with me. Motorbike accidents are everywhere in Thailand. You don't really need statistics to understand that. Sirens are constant, and it's normal to pass crash sites on the way to work. For first responders like him, fatal accidents unfortunately aren't unusual. During one of his late-night shifts, Bon was called to the scene of a crash. A young man in his early 20s had been riding too fast, missed a curve, and lost control. He wasn't wearing a helmet and died instantly on impact. Bon said it was a very routine call. They arrived, secured the scene, confirmed the death, and transported the body back to the station. After that, everything followed normal procedure. Paperwork was completed, the ambulance was parked, powered down, locked, and left for the night. That should have been the end of it, but a few nights later, something strange happened. Bond was working another late shift. Most of the crew had already gone home, so he was inside finishing paperwork. As he sat there writing, he heard something outside. At first, he ignored it. Then he heard it again. It was the sound of someone crying. Very soft, almost like someone quietly weeping and trying not to be heard. He assumed someone wandered into the property. Maybe someone drunk. Maybe someone injured. It happened before, so he didn't immediately think anything was wrong. He walked toward the ambulance bay to check, but there was no one there. The sound didn't stop. It was coming from one of the parked ambulances. He stood there for a moment, listening. The crying came and went, a few seconds at a time before cutting off again, and it sounded undeniably human. He opened the back doors, but the ambulance was empty. Everything inside was off. No radio, no equipment running, nothing that could reasonably explain the sound. He checked the vehicle carefully and found nothing out of place. Eventually, the crying stopped. Bond told himself it was probably stress, maybe his mind playing tricks on him after a long shift. So he closed the doors and went back inside to finish his work. But a few nights later, it happened again. This time he wasn't alone. Bon and another paramedic were outside before a quiet stretch when they both heard it. The same sound, coming from the same ambulance. Neither of them said anything when they heard it. They just stood there listening. Bon asked if the other guy heard it too. He says his coworker nodded immediately. They walked toward the ambulance together. As they got closer, the sound faded and stopped. When they opened the doors, it was empty again. The other paramedic tried to brush it off, saying sound can travel strangely at night, or maybe an animal had been nearby. But they both knew what they heard. Bond told me he knew what animals sounded like. That wasn't that. Over the next couple of weeks, it happened several more times, always late at night. Never during the day. Sometimes it sounded like quiet sobbing. Other times he said it sounded more like uneven breathing, as if someone was trying to calm themselves down. It never lasted long, and it always stopped when someone approached the ambulance. He said the vehicle was inspected more than once, electrical systems were checked, nothing unusual ever showed up. Eventually, Bond mentioned it to one of the other medics, a man who had worked there for decades. When Bond described what had been happening, the older man didn't seem surprised. He simply said that some people die without understanding what's happened to them, especially when they're young. Sometimes, he said, they stay where they were last alive. That's when Bond realized something important. The sounds were coming from the same ambulance he had used to transport the young man from the crash. And Ty believes sudden and violent deaths don't always end cleanly. People who die frightened or confused don't always move on right away. The older medic told him not to dwell on it, just leave it alone. There's nothing you can really do. Eventually, the crying stopped. The ambulance was reassigned during a routine rotation and sent to another station. But Bond never forgot about it. He never tried to convince me it proved anything. He wasn't claiming ghosts were real. He just said that sometimes death isn't neat, and sometimes whatever remains doesn't seem to know where it's supposed to go. And that's kind of depressing. I honestly don't know what I believe. But I still think about how many people spend their final moments in the back of ambulances. How many die suddenly, confused and in pain, surrounded by strangers. And how unsettling it is to imagine that for some of them, it might not end right away. That's one memory from my time in Thailand, and I don't think I'll ever really shake it.